The global potato chip market is valued at $32 billion, and it's said to grow at 4 to 5% rate annually. And the largest consumer is the US at $10.9 billion. And the largest company is Frito-Lay, owned by PepsiCo. What about Kettle Chips? How are they made to be crunchier? How are they made differently than regular potato chips? And are they really healthier than regular potato chips? We'll cover all these and more in our episodes. Stay tuned. Welcome to Behind the Shelf, a podcast about how everyday products are made. My name is Amar.
My name is Tarek, and we are your hosts.
All right, Tarek, are you a fan of potato chips? Do you eat potato chips?
A little bit. I generally I'm very selective about the flavors that I like. I like spicy a lot. Really anything spicy I love. I've even went to Chinatown the other day and I've tried some of their flavors that they have. So the same brand of Lay's, they have very different and specific flavors. There's like some oyster sauce flavor. There's some very, very unique, very different flavor profile than what we have here in the US.
Lay's does a good thing. You said China, but even India, right? The ones that are imported from India, they have like chicken tikka masala as a Lay's chips.
That's a flavor.
Butter chicken flavored. Yeah, butter chicken flavored. Imagine.
That is a much more complex flavor to hit when you're developing those chips, right? Like for here, like sour cream is pretty popular, sour and onion, and then like vinegar and salt. A lot simpler than tikka masala, which is an entire dish you're boiling down into a flavor.
The palate is... To get that palate right, R&D must be doing a hell of a job. So Tarek, potato chips, I mean, they've been around forever, but when did it actually start? When did this like potato chips thing start?
Fried potatoes have been around for a very long time, but specifically potato chips, they were born in Saratoga Springs, New York in 1853 by a guy called Chef Crum. And it was actually born by accident. It was at a restaurant in Saratoga and one of the customers was complaining about how thick the potatoes were. So the chef, George, out of frustration, he just went back to the kitchen and he sliced the potatoes as slim as he could possibly do at the time. And he just fried them, put some salt on them, and sent them back to that customer. And people loved it. And it exploded in popularity from that place. And they even started to sell it to like other restaurants and hotels.
Really, eh?
It became a whole phenomenon back then. And it started that whole trend of potato chips.
Really? I have two questions now.
Yeah.
So the customer was eating like fries?
It was like a fries, yes, obviously a lot thicker and different than what we associate fries with. And that was what's common at the time for potatoes, really.
I feel like New York is the birthplace for so many food topics we've covered.
It doesn't make sense that something like this did not exist before, but at the same time, it makes sense that it is New York because at the time, this is the beginning of the United States and this is the new world and a lot of people migrating from Europe into America to start their lives there again. And when you land in the US, you're landing in New York.
Okay, so this guy in 1853, New York, he started this. What happened next? How did it get to the scale that we see now?
So from then until 1926, it was sold in big bulk barrels in metal tins to hotels, other restaurants. And one of the main problems that they had is that the chips would get stale very quickly because all you're doing is you're putting it in a metal can and you're closing it. There's no proper sealing. So one of the fixes that propelled chips into more popularity is in 1926 when Laura Scruder invented essentially wax paper made bags. She actually asked her employees at the time to take the material with them and iron them at home and form them into bags and then come back and then use them the day after to pack them with potato chips. Nice. So this female entrepreneur started doing that and that improved the quality of potato chips and allowed better transportation because now they last for a lot longer.
Ah, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so she did wax paper. We also have a female entrepreneur in 1926.
And I think this may have been the first female entrepreneur we mentioned in our podcast. I don't think we've had one before. I don't remember anyway. So the following milestone is in 1954 by Joe Murphy. He was an Irish businessman. He kind of grew sick of how plain and dull the potato chips were at the time, crisps, as they call them in Ireland. And at the time, potato chips come in with a packet of salt inside the bag. So The only flavor they
Oh,
had was salted, and it wasn't even salted. You would have to open up the packet and put the salt on them yourself. So
gotcha.
Joe Murphy kind of grew sick of that, and he wanted to kind of innovate in that space. And he was a businessman. So he found a way to add different flavors directly onto the chips in the manufacturing process. And what essentially he did, he would take any flavor he wanted. And by the way, the first flavor ever created of chips besides salt was cheese and onion. He would
Okay.
convert those flavors into powder, dissolve them into liquid, and then he would spray them over the chips. And boom, flavored chips were created.
Yum. So here's the reason we have ketchup lays. Okay, so we reached 1954. We now have flavors introduced. What happens now?
After that, in 1982, kettle cooked chips were invented. So
Okay.
they were invented by a guy called Cameron Healy, and he invented the company brand Kettle Foods. They are the founders, essentially, of Kettle Chips, and they found a different way to prepare and cook the chips that allow them to be crispier and have artisanal, homemade chips that we're familiar with.
So then that brings us to the age-old question. A lot of times in the kettle pop chips are in the organic aisle or in the wellness aisle. They're displayed almost as if they're healthier. Now, Tark, are they healthier?
So let's take opinions out of it. If you look at the nutritional label of a classic Lay's and the same for Kettle sea salt, so both sea salt flavors, and you compare the nutritional, both of them will be somewhat healthy because the ingredient list is the same. It's just potatoes, salt, and oil. But in terms of calories, they're about the same. They're both about 150, 160 calories per 1 ounce. So bottom line is they're about the same.
Yeah, I guess, I know a lot of people listening are probably thinking the same. It's just displayed that way.
It is definitely a branding thing.
So the other type of potato chips I've seen is baked and air fried. I know I use my air fryer like crazy because there's no oil, but I'm assuming it's similar premise to baked. So now are baked and air fried better or healthier?
If you look at the calories per 1 ounce, it's actually lower, and it's about 30 calories per 1 ounce lower. So it's not that much. It is actually lower because you're obviously using less oil to make the product now.
Anyways, so we have regular potato chips. We talked about kettle. We talked about baked. We talked about air fry. How does one make, or how do these manufacturing facilities and big companies like Frito-Lay, how do they make their potato chips?
The first thing they do when a load of potato comes into the factory is that it goes through a rinsing station. And that rinsing station essentially is just breaking down any big chunks of dirt, and it's taking away any rocks that may have come with the load. After that, it goes into a secondary and more important rinsing station, essentially giving them a secondary and a final rinse before they get into the second step. In inspection, what essentially they're doing, they're making sure if there are any remaining defective potato or somewhat half rotten, or there are some pieces of rocks there, shaped, and everything looks good for the next process, which is when you get into slicing and blanching. Once you get into slicing, that's when you push all potatoes into a massive screw auger that essentially pushes them through a small opening with a knife. And the speed of that knife will determine the thickness of the potato chips that you see.
Okay, so at this stage, we've cut it up now. It looks like it's supposed to do. So if it's wavy, it's wavy. If it's thick, it's thick. If it's thin, it's thin.
Yep. And for reference, you're talking about 1.2 to 1.5 millimeter thickness for a potato chip.
Gotcha.
From that, you go into the next step, which is rinsing and blanching. So essentially, if you've ever made fries at home, it's usually very necessary to rinse the potatoes and kind of soak them in water for a little bit, because that help releases the starch more, and that helps control the crispiness and the color.
So how are they cooking in oil? Like, is blanching in oil?
Blanching is in water. It's usually just warm, hot water. After that, you go through a quick drying stage. You're essentially just blowing some hot air onto, not hot, maybe warm air, onto those slices to make sure you wick any excess water out before you go into the frying phase. And this is where you establish the difference between a regular potato chip and a kettle chips. So the difference in how they're made, the temperature and the duration dictates the crispiness, the shape, this quote unquote artisanal look that kettle has. So when we talk about a classic, think of a Lay's days, those would be going through a conveyor belt that is dipped into an oil bath. The temperature
Right.
of that oil is strictly controlled at around 175 to 190 degrees C, and it sits there for around 2 to 3 minutes. It allows them to control the temperature of the oil, which gives them more consistent look and even cooking compared when you look at a kettle chip, you have more slightly uneven cook, makes it look a little homemade. When you look at the kettle chip making, that goes into a batch making process. You have a bathtub of oil that gets heated to about 150 to 175 degrees C for 7 to 9 minutes cook time, during which you're always stirring it, and then you take it out. Now, if you notice with the batch process, because you're dumping the potatoes all together, that drops the oil temperature quite a bit, and that causes this uneven cooking that you typically see with a kettle cooked chips, and that is part of the brand to make it look more homemade.
Okay, so in both scenarios, you're frying or you're using oil. How do they remove that oil? Like I know when I have like when we fry, like we have to pat it down. But how do they do it?
They kind of pat it down with air though. So that's essentially what they do as a following step. The batch after, whether that's a kettle or regular, it goes through a station where they just blow warm air, and it goes through like vibrating conveyors that essentially help push out any excess oil that the potatoes have.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. So up until the point, we haven't mentioned any additional flavorings or seasonings or anything like that. So I'm assuming, is that the next step? After they cook it, then they season?
So before they go into seasoning, the one step they have to do first is some sort of an inspection. And this is critical for something like a kettle cook, because you know you're creating this uneven cooking product, right? This is a cool product that essentially it goes through a machine that is blasting a light on it, and it has a vision system. And it sees anything that is too brown, it has a puff of air that pushes it out to the side. Very similar to what we've talked about in our rice episode. And then it goes into the seasoning station. In the seasoning station, it goes into what we call, it's like a barrel, it's a tumbling barrel. And then from the top, there are nozzles that are spraying the flavors. The speed of that barrel and the duration the chips spend in there determines how much flavor you're getting and how evenly coated the chips are.
Gotcha. So this is kind of similar. These tumbling methods that we talk about, it's very similar to cereal episode, similar to gum episode, right? The same premise.
It's exactly the same process. It's a very standard way of coating something, especially something like this, individual pieces, and it's pretty quick as well.
Okay. So what happens next?
Now you have your chips pretty much done, right? You've cooked them, you've taken out any overcooked stuff, you season them. Now all you have to do is to cool them down. So it goes through another station where you're blowing ambient air to kind of bring the temperature down quickly to get them ready into the packaging station. It's very important to cool them down before you pack them, because the last thing you want is to have steam build up in the bag. Then it gets soggy, it ruins the quality, they stick to each other. An absolute disaster. You have to cool them down, make sure there's no more steam coming out of them before you go into the next and final step of packaging.
Right. That reminds me of our ready to heat rice episode, where when it gets out of the retort, it's cooled down before it's put in a case. So similar thing.
Yes, it's essential to control. This helps you control the customer experience when they open up the bag, whether that's rice or potatoes, because if they're warm in the bag, not only are they going to steam up, but you're also continuing to cook the product, which is a huge issue, right? You want to control how the product feels when it gets to the customer. So the last step here is in the packaging. So it goes into what they call a combination filler. Essentially, what the machine is doing, it's using a set of scales to determine what combination of 2 to 3 scales will fill up the bag to the specification. So if we're filling up 8 ounces, what combination of 2 to 3 scales will add up as close to 8 ounces as possible, and it will open those into an individual bag that will then get sealed from the top and proceed onto the following bag, and so on and so forth. The next step you do is it goes through lot coding. So you're printing the best by date on it. It goes through inspection for x-rays and make sure there are no foreign objects in the bag. And then it gets packaged into boxes and to the shelf.
We have some chips. I know you briefly touched on a few different things. You said metal detector and stuff. Do they do any other quality checks, for example, on the oil or any of the other things during the process?
So The good news with something like a sea salt chips is that it doesn't have a lot of ingredients. So we've already talked about the potatoes. And then for the oil, the only thing they can do is to determine if it's rancid or not. And that's usually just by looking at it, by tasting it. And then they look at the certificate of analysis that comes from the supplier that tells them all the parameters that they're looking for to make sure that the oil is in spec.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. I mean, that brings us to the end of this episode. Man, I'm kind of hungry now for potato chips, to be honest.
Get yourself some baked potatoes, suffer
Yeah, I'm
in
not doing baked.
silence.
I'm not doing baked. I think I got kettle pop chips downstairs. Miss Vicky's. I think I got some Miss Vicky's downstairs.
Ooh, yeah. I've seen Miss Vicky's I see them like in deli stores and things like that. When I go to a grocery store, maybe I don't pay attention to it, but I don't see it outside of like a deli store usually.
All right. Thanks for bringing us through the journey of potato chips and kettle chips. I learned a lot actually. I didn't know. Well, I first of all, I thought it was healthier. So marketeers got me. They got to me. I thought it was
Again,
healthier.
got all of us.
And I didn't know about the blanching step. I'm actually quite surprised they did a pre-step before the frying, which was interesting to know. And then the cooling stage, I thought they would just either ambient it, but they blow ambient air on top of it, which was an interesting take on it. And yeah, so there you have it. That's our potato chip. That's our potato chips episode. And with that, leave us a suggestion on what I want to hear about next. Like, subscribe, follow us on our socials, and we'll be back next time with some banging episodes. My name is Amar.
My name is Tarek. Have a good day.